Alaska, the last frontier, a land of staggering beauty and unforgiving brutality, where snow-capped mountains pierce clouds, where glaciers carve through valleys, where forests stretch for hundreds of miles without a single road. It is a place where nature reigns supreme, where civilization clings to the edges of a vast wilderness, where the line between life and death can be measured in degrees of temperature or miles from the nearest town. In the early 1980s, Anchorage was Alaska's largest city, home to roughly 200,000 people. It sat on the edge of Cook Inlet, surrounded by the Chugach Mountains to the east and endless wilderness to the north, south, and west. The city was a frontier town that had modernized. It had shopping malls, restaurants, hotels, an airport that connected it to the lower 48 states. But step outside the city limits, and you were in another world entirely. A world where grizzly bears outnumbered people, where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, where a person could disappear and never be found. This vast, unforgiving landscape was exactly what Robert Hansen was counting on. Between 1971 and 1983, Hansen abducted at least 17 women, though he later confessed to killing more than 30. Most of his victims were sex workers, exotic dancers, women living on the margins of society. He would approach them in Anchorage, offer them money, lure them to his car. Some he raped and released. Others he drove to his home in the suburbs. And some, the ones who saw his face, who could identify him, who represented a threat, he took on a very different journey. Hansen was a private pilot. He owned a Piper Super Cub, a small bush plane perfectly suited for Alaska's backcountry. He would bind his victims, load them into his plane, and fly them to remote cabins he had built or discovered in the wilderness. There, miles from any other human being, he would let them go. He would give them a head start. And then, armed with a hunting rifle or a .223 caliber Ruger Mini-14, he would hunt them. He hunted women the way other men hunted deer or moose. He tracked them through the snow. He watched them run, stumbling through the underbrush, desperately trying to find shelter or hide. And when he had them in his sights, he pulled the trigger. Some victims were shot in the back as they fled. Others were shot execution style after being recaptured. When it was over, Hansen would bury the bodies in shallow graves or leave them exposed to the elements and the scavengers. Then he would fly home, return to his bakery, kiss his wife, and go to bed. For more than a decade, Robert Hansen moved through Anchorage as an ordinary citizen. He ran a successful bakery. He was married with 2 children. He participated in local hunting competitions and won trophies for his marksmanship. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, hardworking man, a little awkward perhaps, but harmless. They had no idea that the man who sold them pastries and bread was also one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The vastness of Alaska made Hansen's crimes possible. Bodies that might have been discovered within days in other states could lie undisturbed for years in the Alaskan wilderness. Animals scattered remains, snow-covered graves. The sheer size of the landscape meant that even if someone went missing, the search area was impossibly large. And Hansen's victims were chosen specifically because he believed no one would look for them. Sex workers, runaways, women estranged from their families. Women whose disappearances, Hansen assumed, would not be investigated. But he was wrong. In the summer of 1983, a young woman managed to escape from Robert Hansen. She ran from his car, half naked and handcuffed, flagging down a passing motorist on a highway outside Anchorage. She told police that a man had abducted her at gunpoint, taken her to his house, raped her, and was preparing to fly her somewhere remote when she managed to break free. She gave police a description of her attacker. She described his house, his plane, his vehicle. The Anchorage Police Department took her statement, but the suspect she described was Robert Hansen, a respected local businessman with no criminal record. When police questioned Hansen, he denied everything. He said the woman was a prostitute who was angry because he refused to pay her. He presented himself as a victim of false accusations. And initially, the police believed him. But one detective, a state trooper named Glenn Floth, was not convinced. Floth had been investigating a series of missing women and unsolved murders in the Anchorage area. Bodies had been discovered in the wilderness, decomposed, partially eaten by animals, difficult to identify. The cases had gone cold, but the woman's testimony about Hansen gave Floth a thread to pull. He began digging into Hansen's background. He obtained search warrants. He built a case piece by piece. And on October 27, 1983, Alaska state troopers arrested Robert Christian Hansen at his home in Anchorage. Inside his house, they found a cache of weapons, trophies taken from victims, and, most damning of all, an aviation map with more than 20 locations marked with small X's. Each X corresponded to a place where Hansen had buried or dumped a body. The map led investigators into the wilderness. Over the following months, search teams recovered remains from remote locations across the state. Some bodies were intact enough to identify. Others were merely bones scattered by animals and weather. The victims were women in their teens and 20s. They had been shot, stabbed, strangled. They had died alone in the cold, far from anyone who could help them. Robert Hansen eventually confessed to killing 17 women, though investigators believe the true number is higher, possibly more than 30. He provided details that only the killer could know. He described how he had hunted them, where he had buried them, what weapons he had used. He spoke about his crimes with chilling detachment, as if discussing a successful hunting trip rather than the murder of human beings. The case of Robert Hansen is a study in how predators exploit vulnerabilities, both in their victims and in the systems meant to protect them. Hansen targeted women who were marginalized, whose disappearances would not trigger immediate alarm. He used the isolation of Alaska to his advantage, understanding that the wilderness would conceal his crimes, and he relied on his reputation as a normal, law-abiding citizen to deflect suspicion. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Robert Hansen was a man consumed by rage and a need for control. His childhood had been marked by cruelty and rejection. He had been bullied mercilessly, mocked for his appearance and his stutter. He had grown up feeling powerless and humiliated, and as an adult, he found a way to reclaim that power by dominating and destroying women who, in his mind, represented everything he had been denied. This is the story of Robert Hansen, the butcher-baker. It is the story of the women he killed, whose names and lives must be remembered. It is the story of the investigators who refused to let his crimes go unsolved. And it is a reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the person who serves you coffee in the morning, who waves to you from across the street, who lives in the house next door. Part 2: The Making of a Killer. To understand how Robert Hansen became a serial killer, we must begin with his childhood. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa, a small town in the northwestern part of the state. Estherville was a quintessentially American Midwestern community, population around 8,000, surrounded by farmland, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of town where children rode their bikes freely, where neighbors left their doors unlocked, where church attendance on Sunday was expected. Robert's father, Christian Hansen, was a Danish immigrant who owned and operated a bakery in Estherville. The bakery was the family's livelihood, and Christian ran it with strict discipline. He was a demanding man, a perfectionist who expected his children to work hard and never complain. He had immigrated to America seeking opportunity, and he believed that success came through relentless effort and adherence to traditional values. Robert's mother, Edna Hansen, was quieter, more passive. She deferred to her husband in all things and focused her energies on maintaining the household and raising the children. Robert had one sibling, a younger brother, and the two boys grew up immersed in the routines of small-town life and the bakery business. From the outside, the Hansen family appeared normal, even successful. Christian's bakery was well regarded in the community. The family attended church. They lived modestly but comfortably. But inside the home, Robert's childhood was far from idyllic. Robert was born with severe acne that scarred his face. The condition worsened during his adolescence, covering his cheeks, forehead, and jawline with painful cysts and blemishes. The scarring was deep and permanent, leaving his face pockmarked and uneven. In an era before effective dermatological treatments, there was little that could be done. Robert's appearance became a defining feature of his identity, something he could not escape. He also had a stutter. The speech impediment made him self-conscious and hesitant to speak in public. When he did talk, words caught in his throat, syllables repeated, sentences came out in halting fragments. Other children noticed, and they were cruel. School was torment for Robert Hansen. He was mocked relentlessly. Classmates called him pizza face and other derogatory names. They imitated his stutter, laughing at his attempts to speak. He was excluded from social groups, ignored by girls, treated as an object of ridicule rather than a person. The bullying was constant and unrelenting, a daily assault on his self-esteem. Robert retreated inward. He became withdrawn and socially isolated. He had no close friends. He spent his free time alone, either working in his father's bakery or escaping into the woods surrounding Esterville. It was in the woods that Robert found something he could control: hunting. Hunting gave Robert a sense of power and competence that he lacked in every other area of his life. He learned to track animals, to read signs in the underbrush, to move silently through the forest. He practiced with a rifle until his aim was near perfect. He felt a thrill when he successfully stalked and killed prey, a sense of mastery, of dominance, of being in control. The animals could not mock him or reject him. They could only run, and when they ran, he could hunt them down. Robert's father encouraged his interest in hunting. Christian saw it as a masculine, wholesome activity, something that would toughen his son and teach him discipline. But Christian was also a harsh taskmaster. He criticized Robert constantly, pointing out mistakes, demanding perfection, withholding praise. Nothing Robert did was ever good enough. Christian's approval was conditional and elusive, always just out of reach. The combination of relentless bullying at school and constant criticism at home created a deep well of anger and resentment in Robert. He felt powerless, humiliated, worthless. And as he grew older, that anger began to focus on specific targets: women. In Robert's adolescent mind, his suffering was caused by his inability to attract female attention. Girls rejected him because of his appearance and his stutter. They laughed at him or ignored him. He watched from the sidelines as other boys dated, formed relationships, experienced the validation that came from being desired. Robert had none of that. He was invisible at best, an object of disgust at worst. This rejection bred a toxic mix of longing and hatred. Robert wanted women's approval desperately, but he also resented them for withholding it. He began to see women not as individuals, but as gatekeepers of something he was owed but denied. This sense of entitlement, combined with his inability to connect with women in healthy ways, laid the groundwork for the violence that would come later. After graduating from high school in 1957, Robert enlisted in the United States Army Reserve. Military service was common for young men of his generation, and Robert hoped it might provide structure, purpose, and perhaps a fresh start. He served for a year, completing basic training and working as a reservist. The experience did little to change him. He remained socially awkward and isolated, though he continued to develop his skills as a marksman. After his discharge, Robert returned to Esterville and worked in his father's bakery. He learned the trade: how to mix dough, how to bake bread and pastries, how to manage the business side of running a bakery. The work was repetitive and demanding, but Robert was good at it. Baking was something he could control, a skill he could perfect. In 1960, at the age of 21, Robert married a woman named Marilyn Johnson. It is unclear how they met or what drew them together. Marilyn was described by those who knew her as quiet and reserved. The marriage appears to have been driven more by Robert's desperation for normalcy and acceptance than by any deep emotional connection. The marriage quickly became troubled. Robert's anger and insecurity manifested in controlling behavior. He was jealous and possessive. He accused Marilyn of infidelity without cause. He struggled with impotence, which only deepened his sense of inadequacy and rage. The relationship deteriorated rapidly, and within a few years, Marilyn left him. The marriage ended in divorce. The failure of his marriage confirmed Robert's worst beliefs about himself, that he was undesirable, that women would always reject him, that he was fundamentally unworthy of love and respect. His anger intensified, and around this time, Robert began to commit his first crimes. In 1960, Robert was arrested for arson. He had set fire to a school bus garage in Pocahontas, Iowa, apparently in retaliation for some perceived slight. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, though he served only 20 months before being released on parole. Prison did not rehabilitate Robert Hansen. If anything, it hardened him. He learned to hide his anger, to present a facade of compliance and normalcy while nursing his grievances internally. He became more calculating, more careful. He learned that direct expressions of rage led to punishment, but that rage channeled through manipulation and deception could go undetected. After his release, Robert decided to leave Iowa. The stigma of his criminal record, combined with his failed marriage and the memories of his miserable childhood, made staying in Estherville unbearable. He needed a fresh start, a place where no one knew his past, and he found it in Alaska. In 1967, Robert Hansen moved to Anchorage. Alaska was experiencing an economic boom. The discovery of oil on the North Slope had brought an influx of workers, money, and opportunity. Anchorage was growing rapidly, and the frontier atmosphere meant that a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work. It was the perfect place for someone like Robert to reinvent himself. Robert opened a bakery in Anchorage. He called it Hansen's Bakery, and it quickly became successful. Robert was a skilled baker, and his products were well regarded. He worked long hours, built a reputation for quality, and integrated himself into the community. He joined local hunting clubs and participated in competitive shooting events, winning trophies and establishing himself as an expert marksman. In 1967, shortly after arriving in Alaska, Robert married again. His second wife, Darla Henrichsen, was a quiet, religious woman who worked as a hotel clerk. They met through mutual acquaintances and married quickly. Darla was unaware of Robert's criminal past. He had told her nothing about his arson conviction or his time in prison. To Darla, Robert was simply a hardworking baker who loved hunting and the outdoors. The couple had 2 children, a son and a daughter. They bought a house in a suburban neighborhood in Anchorage. Robert coached Little League, attended church with his family, and participated in community events. To all outward appearances, he was a model citizen, a devoted husband, a caring father, a successful businessman. But beneath the surface, Robert Hansen was living a double life. The rage and sexual frustration that had defined his adolescence had not disappeared. They had only been buried, waiting for an outlet. And in the early 1970s, Robert found that outlet. He began frequenting Anchorage's red light district, a seedy area downtown where sex workers, addicts, and transients congregated. Robert sought out prostitutes, paying them for sex, but the encounters were not about pleasure. They were about power. Robert wanted to dominate and control women, to force them into submission, to make them experience the fear and helplessness he had felt as a child. Some of these encounters turned violent. Robert would become rough, aggressive. Some women complained, but most did not. They took his money and tried to forget the experience. And because they were sex workers, women operating outside the law, women whom society often dismissed and ignored, their complaints went nowhere. It was during this period that Robert Hansen began to fantasize about something more extreme. Paying for sex was not enough. Rough treatment was not enough. He wanted complete control. He wanted to see terror in a woman's eyes, to watch her beg, to know that her life was entirely in his hands. And he began to imagine how he might achieve that. Alaska's wilderness provided the answer. Robert was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew the backcountry as well as anyone. He owned a plane and could fly to remote locations where no one would ever find him, and he had perfected his hunting skills over decades. All he needed was the right kind of prey. In 1971, Robert Hansen committed his first known murder. The victim's identity remains uncertain, as Hansen provided conflicting information over the years. But what is known is that the pattern that would define his killing spree had been established. He abducted a woman from Anchorage, flew her to a remote location, and killed her. And he did not stop. Part 3. The First VICTMS. The early 1970s in Anchorage were a time of rapid growth and transition. The city was booming, fueled by oil money and an influx of workers from across the United States. Construction projects dotted the skyline. New businesses opened. The population swelled. But with growth came the darker side of urbanization: crime, addiction, prostitution. Anchorage's red light district, centered around 4th Avenue downtown, was a world unto itself. Bars with blacked-out windows lined the streets. Strip clubs advertised with neon signs. Women in heavy makeup and short skirts stood on corners, propositioning passing cars. The area attracted drifters, criminals, men looking for anonymous encounters. It was a place where people could disappear into the shadows, where transactions happened quickly and quietly, where the rules that governed polite society did not apply. For Robert Hansen, the red light district was a hunting ground. Hansen was a regular presence in the area by the early 1970s. He would drive through 4th Avenue after closing his bakery, scanning the sidewalks, looking for women who fit his preferences. He was drawn to younger women, often teenagers, women who appeared vulnerable or desperate. He would approach them, offer money for sex, and negotiate terms. Some encounters were straightforward transactions. He paid, the woman provided services, and both went their separate ways. But other encounters were different. Hansen began to select certain women, those who seemed particularly isolated, who had no family ties, who were addicted to drugs, who would not be immediately missed if they vanished. These women, Hansen believed, were perfect victims. Society had already written them off. If they disappeared, who would care? Who would investigate? Hansen's first confirmed murder victim was a woman whose identity has never been conclusively established. Hansen himself provided conflicting accounts over the years, sometimes claiming his first kill was in 1971, other times suggesting it was earlier or later. What is clear is that by the early 1970s, Hansen had crossed the line from fantasy to action. He had killed, and he had gotten away with it. The killing likely followed the pattern that would characterize all of Hansen's murders. He picked up a woman in Anchorage, probably from the red light district. He drove her somewhere secluded, perhaps his home, perhaps a remote area outside the city. He raped her. And then, rather than release her, he made the decision to kill her. He may have strangled her, shot her, or used some other method. And then he disposed of her body, likely in a remote wilderness location where it would never be found. The success of that first murder emboldened Hansen. He had committed the ultimate transgression, and no one had stopped him. No alarms had been raised. No investigation had been launched. The woman was simply gone, one more person who had vanished into the vastness of Alaska. Over the next few years, Hansen continued to kill, though the exact timeline and number of victims from this early period remain uncertain. What is known is that by the mid-1970s, women were disappearing from Anchorage at an alarming rate. Most were sex workers or exotic dancers. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Most had histories of drug use or estrangement from their families. The Anchorage Police Department received missing persons reports, but the cases were not prioritized. The prevailing attitude among many law enforcement officers was that these women had simply moved on to another city, another state, another life. Sex workers were transient by nature. They came and went. The fact that so many were vanishing was noted, but not investigated with any urgency. This systemic indifference was exactly what Hansen was counting on. He understood that society's disregard for his victims would provide him cover, and he was right. One of Hansen's early victims was Joanna Messina, though her case would not be connected to Hansen until much later. Messina was a young woman who had come to Alaska seeking adventure and opportunity. She worked as a topless dancer at a club in Anchorage. On July 8, 1980, Messina was seen leaving the club with a man. She was never seen alive again. Messina's body was discovered months later in a gravel pit near Seward, Alaska, about 100 miles south of Anchorage. She had been shot. The case went cold. Investigators had no leads, no suspects, no clear motive. It would be years before Robert Hansen's name was connected to her death. Another victim from this period was Lisa Futrell, a 24-year-old woman who was last seen in Anchorage in September 1980. Futrell had struggled with addiction and had worked as a sex worker to support her habit. She vanished without a trace and her family reported her missing, but the investigation went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no clues, no body. Years later, Hansen would confess to killing Futrell. He described picking her up in Anchorage, flying her to a remote location, and hunting her like an animal. He said he had shot her and buried her body in a shallow grave. Investigators eventually recovered Futrell's remains from the location Hansen described, confirming his confession. The pattern of Hansen's crimes was becoming clear, though at the time no one recognized it. He would select a victim from Anchorage's sex work community. He would lure her with the promise of money. He would take her somewhere isolated, sometimes his home, sometimes a remote cabin, sometimes directly to his plane. He would rape her. And then, if he believed she could identify him or if she resisted in a way that angered him, he would kill her. But not all of Hansen's victims were killed in the wilderness. Some were murdered in Anchorage itself, their bodies dumped in urban locations. In 1980, the body of a young woman later identified as Eklutna Annie was discovered along the Eklutna Road, a highway northeast of Anchorage. She had been killed elsewhere and dumped. Her identity remained unknown for decades, and it was not until 2023 that investigators were able to identify her through DNA analysis. Hansen's ability to avoid detection during this period was due to several factors. First, his victims were chosen specifically because their disappearances would not trigger intensive investigations. Second, the vastness of Alaska meant that bodies dumped in the wilderness were unlikely to be found. Third, Hansen presented himself as a model citizen, a family man, a successful businessman, a respectable member of the community. No one suspected him. But Hansen's crimes were escalating. The thrill of murder was becoming addictive. He was killing more frequently, taking greater risks, refining his methods, and he was developing a ritual. By the late 1970s, Hansen had fully embraced his twisted fantasy, hunting women like game animals. He would fly his victims to remote locations in his Piper Super Cub, land on a makeshift airstrip or frozen lake and release them. He would give them a head start, sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes longer. And then he would pursue them, tracking them through the wilderness, stalking them as they ran. When he had them in his sights, he would kill them with a rifle. This was not murder born of rage or impulse. This was murder as sport, as entertainment, as the ultimate expression of domination. Hansen saw himself as a hunter, his victims as prey. And in his mind, he was simply engaging in a more challenging version of the activity he had loved since childhood. Hansen kept trophies from his kills. He took jewelry, identification, personal items. He kept them in his home, hidden away in a crawl space or tucked into drawers where his wife would not find them. These trophies were proof of his power, tangible reminders of his control over the women he had killed. By 1983, Robert Hansen had been killing for more than a decade. He had murdered at least 17 women and possibly many more. He had perfected his methods, evaded detection, and lived a comfortable double life. His bakery was thriving. His family was intact. His reputation in the community was solid. But his luck was about to run out. In June 1983, Hansen made a critical mistake. He abducted a woman named Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker. He took her to his house, raped her, and prepared to fly her to a remote location where he intended to kill her. But Paulson managed to escape. She ran from his car, half naked and handcuffed, and flagged down a passing truck on the highway. Paulson gave police a detailed description of her attacker and his house. She described the plane, the weapons, the methodical way he had prepared to take her life. And she gave them a name, Robert Hansen. For the first time, law enforcement had a living witness and a credible suspect. The investigation that would finally bring down the butcher baker was about to begin. Part 4: The Survivors. Not every woman Robert Hansen abducted was killed. Some, like Cindy Paulson, managed to escape. Others were released after being raped, either because Hansen believed they would not go to the police or because he had not yet decided to escalate to murder. These survivors would become critical to the investigation that eventually brought Hansen to justice. Understanding Hansen's decision-making process is essential to understanding why some women lived and others died. Hansen did not kill indiscriminately. His murders were calculated, based on his assessment of risk and his desire for control. If a woman seemed compliant, if she did not resist or threaten to report him, if she appeared unlikely to be believed by police, Hansen might let her go. But if a woman fought back, if she saw too much, if she represented a threat to his carefully constructed double life, Hansen would kill her. The survivors' stories are harrowing. They describe a man who was charming at first, offering easy money for what seemed like a simple transaction. But once they were in his control, in his car, in his house, on his plane, the facade dropped. Hansen became cold, methodical, terrifying. He would bind them, rape them, and in some cases, describe in detail what he planned to do next. Some women were told explicitly that they were going to die. Others simply understood from his actions that escape was their only chance at survival. One survivor, whose name has been withheld to protect her privacy, later described an encounter with Hansen in the late 1970s. She was working as a dancer at a club in Anchorage when Hansen approached her. He offered her money for sex, and she agreed. They went to his car, where he drove her to a secluded area outside the city. There, he raped her at gunpoint, threatening to kill her if she resisted. When it was over, he gave her the money he had promised and drove her back to Anchorage. He told her that if she went to the police, he would find her and kill her. The woman did not report the assault. She was terrified of Hansen, and she also knew that as a sex worker, she was unlikely to be believed. The police, she assumed, would not take her seriously, so she remained silent, carrying the trauma of the encounter but saying nothing. This pattern repeated itself many times. Hansen raped numerous women who never reported the crimes. They were afraid, they were ashamed, and they had no faith that the criminal justice system would protect them. Hansen exploited this dynamic ruthlessly. He knew that his victims' marginalized status made them vulnerable, and he used that vulnerability to his advantage. But in June 1983, Hansen's strategy failed. He abducted Cindy Paulson and she escaped. And this time, she went to the police. Cindy Paulson was 17 years old in the summer of 1983. She had come to Alaska from the lower 48, drawn by promises of work and a fresh start. Like many young women who ended up in Anchorage's sex work industry, Paulson's life had been marked by instability and trauma. She had run away from home, struggled with addiction, and found herself surviving on the streets. On June 13, 1983, Paulson was working in downtown Anchorage when a man approached her. He was in his 40s, average height, with a scarred face and a slight stutter. He offered her $200 for oral sex. Paulson agreed and they got into his car, a Datsun station wagon. But instead of driving to a nearby location as Paulson expected, Hansen drove her to his house in the suburbs. It was a modest, well-kept home in a middle-class neighborhood. Hansen led her inside, where he pulled out a gun and handcuffed her. Paulson realized immediately that she was in serious danger. Hansen raped Paulson repeatedly over the next several hours. He told her that he was going to fly her somewhere remote and that she would never be seen again. He showed her his plane, described how he had killed other women, and made it clear that he intended to do the same to her. But Hansen made a critical error. He left Paulson briefly, and in that moment she managed to work one hand free from the handcuffs. When Hansen returned, Paulson pretended to be compliant, waiting for another opportunity. That opportunity came when Hansen was loading her into his car to drive to the airport. As they drove through a residential area, Paulson suddenly opened the car door and threw herself out onto the street. She landed hard on the pavement, her wrists still handcuffed, wearing only a small amount of clothing. Cars were passing by. Hansen hesitated. Killing her here in public would be far too risky. He sped away, leaving Paulson on the side of the road. Paulson flagged down a passing truck. The driver, shocked by her appearance and her story, called the police. Within minutes, officers from the Anchorage Police Department arrived. Paulson was hysterical, terrified, but coherent. She told them everything: the man's name, his address, his car, his plane, his plans to kill her. The officers took her statement, but their response was initially skeptical. Paulson was a known sex worker with a history of drug use. Her story, while dramatic, seemed almost too extreme to be believed. And the man she was accusing, Robert Hansen, was a respected member of the community with no criminal record in Alaska. The officers contacted Hansen, who came to the police station voluntarily. He was calm, polite, cooperative. He admitted that he had picked up Paulson and that they had negotiated for sex. But he claimed that she had tried to rob him, that he had refused to pay her, and that she was now making up stories to get back at him. He presented himself as a victim of a con artist. The initial investigators were inclined to believe Hansen. He was a businessman. He had a family. He had no record. Paulson, on the other hand, was a sex worker with a criminal history. The case seemed like a classic, he said, she said situation, and the credibility balance appeared to tip in Hansen's favor. But one investigator was not satisfied with this conclusion. Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Glenn Floth had been working on a series of unsolved murders and missing persons cases involving young women in the Anchorage area. He had seen patterns, similar victim profiles, similar circumstances of disappearance, bodies found in remote wilderness locations. Paulson's story resonated with what Floth had been suspecting, that there was a serial killer operating in Anchorage. Floth interviewed Paulson extensively. He listened to her story, noted the consistency of her account, and observed her genuine terror. He believed her, and he decided to investigate Robert Hansen. Floth began by looking into Hansen's background. He discovered that Hansen had a criminal record from his time in Iowa, an arson conviction and prison time. This was significant. Hansen had presented himself as a law-abiding citizen, but he had a history of serious criminal behavior. Floth also interviewed some of Hansen's acquaintances and looked into his activities. He learned that Hansen was an avid hunter, a skilled marksman, and a pilot with access to remote areas. All of this fit the profile of the killer Floth had been trying to identify. But Floth needed more than suspicion. He needed evidence, and that meant obtaining search warrants for Hansen's home, his vehicle, and his plane. The legal process was slow and frustrating. Judges were reluctant to authorize searches based solely on the testimony of a sex worker accusing a respected businessman. But Floth was persistent. He built his case methodically, documenting the connections between Paulson's account and the pattern of disappearances. He argued that there was probable cause to believe Hansen was involved in serious crimes. Eventually, Floth obtained the warrants he needed, and on October 27, 1983, Alaska state troopers executed a search of Robert Hansen's home and property. What they found was beyond anything they had anticipated. Part 5. The Evidence. The morning of October 27, 1983, was cold and overcast in Anchorage. A team of Alaska state troopers, led by Sergeant Glenn Floth, arrived at Robert Hansen's home with search warrants in hand. The house was a modest split level in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. It was the last place anyone would expect to find evidence of serial murder. Hansen was at home when the police arrived. He answered the door calmly, though his demeanor betrayed a hint of nervousness. The troopers informed him of the search warrants and began their work. Hansen's wife, Darla, and their children were present, confused and frightened by the sudden intrusion of law enforcement. The search was methodical and comprehensive. Officers combed through every room, opening drawers, searching closets, checking under furniture. They were looking for anything that might connect Hansen to the murders and disappearances Floth had been investigating: weapons, personal items belonging to victims, maps, photographs. In Hansen's basement, investigators found a cache of weapons. Hansen was a hunter, so the presence of rifles and shotguns was not surprising, but the sheer number of firearms was notable. Hansen had more than 30 guns, including high-powered rifles, handguns, and specialty hunting weapons. Among them was a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle, the same caliber used in several of the murders. But the most damning evidence was found elsewhere in the house. In a crawlspace beneath the master bedroom, investigators discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were items that could only have belonged to victims: jewelry, identification cards, driver's licenses, personal effects. Each item represented a woman who had disappeared. Some of the items would later be matched to specific victims whose families had reported them missing. The jewelry was particularly haunting. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, personal items that women would have worn that had meaning and value to them. Hansen had kept them as trophies, proof of his conquests, reminders of the power he had wielded over these women's lives. Investigators also found an aviation map. It was a standard aeronautical chart of the Anchorage area and the surrounding wilderness, the kind any pilot might own. But this map had been marked. Small X's had been drawn in ink at various locations, spots deep in the wilderness, far from roads or settlements. Floth immediately understood the significance of the map. Each X, he suspected, marked a burial site. Hansen had been methodical even in death, keeping a record of where he had dumped or buried his victims. The map would become the key piece of evidence in the case. Over the following months, investigators would use it to locate remains in the wilderness, confirming Floth's theory and bringing closure to families who had been searching for missing loved ones. In addition to the physical evidence found in the house, investigators also seized Hansen's plane, a Piper Super Cub. The aircraft was searched for evidence, and forensic teams examined it for traces of blood, hair, or other biological material. While the plane had been cleaned, investigators found enough trace evidence to suggest that it had been used to transport victims. Confronted with the evidence, Robert Hansen initially denied everything. He claimed the jewelry and identification cards belonged to his wife or had been purchased at thrift stores. He said the marked map was simply a record of hunting trips. He insisted that he was being framed, that the police were trying to pin unsolved crimes on him because he had once been falsely accused by Cindy Paulson. But Floth was patient. He knew that building a case against Hansen would require not just physical evidence but also a confession. He interviewed Hansen multiple times, gradually breaking down his defenses, confronting him with the evidence, appealing to his ego and his desire to be recognized for his intelligence. And slowly, Hansen began to crack. The breakthrough came when Floth suggested that Hansen might want to tell his side of the story, to explain why he had done what he had done. Floth framed it not as an interrogation, but as an opportunity for Hansen to be understood, to have his motivations acknowledged. This approach appealed to Hansen's narcissism. He wanted to be seen as someone special, someone whose actions had meaning and purpose. Hansen began to talk. At first he was evasive, offering partial admissions and vague details. But as the conversations continued, he provided more information. He admitted to abducting women. He admitted to raping them. And eventually, he admitted to killing them. Over the course of several interviews, Hansen confessed to murdering 17 women. He described how he had selected them, how he had lured them, how he had taken them to remote locations and hunted them like animals. He spoke about his crimes with a chilling detachment, as if he were describing a successful elk hunt rather than the murder of human beings. Hansen provided specific details about each victim, where he had picked them up, what they had been wearing, how they had died, where he had buried or dumped their bodies. Some of the locations he described matched the X's on the aviation map. Others were new, previously unknown burial sites. The confession was meticulously documented. Floth recorded the interviews, and prosecutors prepared to use Hansen's own words against him in court. But Floth knew that a confession alone might not be enough. Defense attorneys could argue that Hansen had been coerced, that his statements were unreliable. To build an ironclad case, investigators needed to corroborate Hansen's confession with physical evidence. And that meant recovering bodies. Using the aviation map and Hansen's descriptions, search teams were dispatched into the Alaskan wilderness. The searches were difficult and dangerous. Many of the sites were accessible only by helicopter or small plane. The terrain was rugged, dense forests, steep mountains, areas prone to avalanches and sudden weather changes. And the remains, if they existed, had been exposed to the elements for years, scattered by animals, covered by snow and vegetation. But the search teams were thorough. They used dogs trained to detect human remains. They employed forensic anthropologists who could identify bones and reconstruct what had happened to the victims. And slowly, they began to find bodies. The first remains were discovered at a site near the Nick River, northeast of Anchorage. The body was badly decomposed, reduced mostly to bones. But forensic analysis revealed that the victim had been shot, and the location matched one of the X's on Hansen's map. More bodies followed. Investigators found remains near Eklutna Lake, along the Nick Arm in the Matanuska Valley, and in other remote locations across south-central Alaska. Each discovery was painstaking work, requiring careful excavation and documentation. Some victims could be identified through dental records or personal effects found with the remains. Others remained unidentified, their names lost to time and the wilderness. By the end of 1983, investigators had recovered the remains of 11 victims. Each set of remains corroborated Hansen's confession. The victims had been shot, often multiple times. Some had been buried in shallow graves. Others had been left exposed, their bodies scattered by scavengers. The evidence was overwhelming. Hansen's victims were primarily young women in their late teens and early 20s. Most had been involved in sex work or exotic dancing. Many had struggled with addiction. They came from broken homes, had histories of abuse, and were estranged from their families. They were women society had failed, women who had fallen through the cracks, women whom Hansen believed no one would miss. But they were missed. Families had been searching for them, holding out hope that they might still be alive. The discovery of their remains brought a painful closure, confirmation that their loved ones were gone, but also an end to the agonizing uncertainty. As the evidence mounted, Robert Hansen was formally charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, rape, and weapons offenses. The case against him was built on the physical evidence found in his home, the testimonies of survivors like Cindy Paulson, and his own detailed confession. Hansen's attorneys faced an impossible task. Their client had confessed. Physical evidence linked him to the crimes. Survivors could testify against him. The prosecution had an overwhelming case. The only question was whether Hansen would go to trial or accept a plea deal. In February 1984, Hansen's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping, Hansen would avoid the death penalty and receive a sentence of 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He would also agree to provide investigators with information about additional victims. Hansen accepted the deal. On February 18, 1984, he appeared in court and formally pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison. The judge stated that the sentence was intended to ensure that Hansen would never be released, that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for the atrocities he had committed. After sentencing, Hansen was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in Seward, Alaska. He would spend the remainder of his life there, removed from society, his hunting days over. But the investigation did not end with Hansen's imprisonment. Floth and other investigators continued to work on identifying victims and locating additional remains. Hansen had confessed to killing 17 women, but he had also hinted that there might be more. He spoke vaguely about victims he could not remember clearly, about bodies he had dumped in locations he could no longer pinpoint. Investigators believed the true number of Hansen's victims could be 30 or more. Over the years, additional remains were discovered in the Alaskan wilderness, some of which were linked to Hansen. Other cases remained unsolved, and it is possible that Hansen took secrets to the grave, victims whose names and stories will never be fully known. The case of Robert Hansen stands as one of the most extensive and chilling serial murder investigations in American history. It revealed the vulnerability of marginalized women, the failures of law enforcement to prioritize crimes against sex workers, and the capacity of seemingly ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. Part 6. The VICTIMS RMMBRED. In the tradition of this series, we now honor the victims of Robert Hansen. These were not just statistics or case files. They were human beings with names, with families, with hopes and dreams. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Their lives mattered, and though they died alone and afraid in the Alaskan wilderness, they must be remembered. What follows is a list of Robert Hansen's confirmed victims, based on his confession and the recovery of remains. Some victims have been identified. Others remain unknown, their identities lost despite decades of investigation. We honor each of them. 1. Unidentified victim, possibly 1970, 11973. Robert Hansen confessed to committing his first murder in the early 1970s, but he provided conflicting information about the victim's identity. This woman, whose name we may never know, was likely a sex worker from Anchorage. She was killed and her body disposed of in a location that has never been found. We remember you, unknown victim. You were a person, you had a life, you mattered. 2. Jonna Messina. Born, approximate year 1957. Died July 1980. Age, approximately 23 years old. Jonna Messina came to Alaska seeking adventure and opportunity. She worked as a topless dancer at a club in Anchorage. On July 8, 1980, she was seen leaving the club with a man. She was never seen alive again. Her body was discovered months later in a gravel pit near Seward. She had been shot. Joanna was a vibrant young woman who loved music and had dreams of making a better life for herself. She was taken from this world violently and buried in a remote gravel pit, discarded as if she did not matter. But she did matter. Joanna Messina, we remember you. 3. Lisa Futrll. Born 1956. Died September 1980. Age 24 years old. Lisa Futrell was last seen in Anchorage in September 1980. She had struggled with addiction and had turned to sex work to survive. Her family reported her missing, but the investigation went nowhere. Years later, Robert Hansen confessed to killing her. He described picking her up in Anchorage, flying her to a remote location, and hunting her. He shot her and buried her body in a shallow grave. Lisa's remains were eventually recovered based on Hansen's directions. She had been shot multiple times. She died terrified and alone, running through the wilderness, knowing she was being hunted. Lisa Futrell, we remember you. 4. Sherry Morrow. Born 1959. Died November 1981. Age 22 years old. Sherry Morrow was a young woman who worked in Anchorage. On November 17, 1981, she vanished. Her body was found in a shallow grave on the Nick River in April 1984 after Hansen's confession. She had been shot 3 times. Sherry was known for her kindness and her infectious laugh. She had struggled with personal demons but was working to build a better life. Instead, she was kidnapped, terrorized, and murdered. Her family mourned her loss and never stopped loving her. Sherry Morrow, we remember you. 5. Andrea Ekalutna identified 2023. Born approximate year 1958. Died 1980. Age approximately 22 years old. For more than 4 decades, this victim was known only as Eklutna Annie. Her body was discovered along the Eklutna Road in 1980. She had been killed elsewhere and dumped. Despite extensive efforts, her identity remained unknown until 2023, when DNA analysis and genetic genealogy finally revealed her name, Andrea Altieri. Andrea had come to Alaska seeking work and a fresh start. Instead, she became one of Robert Hansen's victims. She was killed and discarded on the side of a road, her identity stripped from her. Her family left to wonder what had happened to her for more than 40 years. In 2023, investigators finally gave Andrea her name back. Her family learned the truth about her fate. It was a bittersweet closure, answers after decades of uncertainty, but confirmation that she had died violently and alone. Andrea Altieri, we remember you. 6. Sue Luna. Born 1960. Died May 1982. Age 22 years old. Sue Luna disappeared from Anchorage in May 1982. Her body was found in a gravel pit in April 1984 after Hansen's confession. She had been shot. Sue was a young woman trying to survive in a difficult world. She had turned to exotic dancing to make money, hoping to eventually save enough to move on to something better. Instead, she was abducted, raped, murdered, and buried in a gravel pit. Sue Luna, we remember you. 7. Larcn. Born approximate year 1959. Died June 1983. Age approximately 24 years old. Malai Larson's body was discovered on the Nick River in September 1983 before Hansen was arrested. She had been shot multiple times. At the time of discovery, investigators did not know who had killed her. Hansen later confessed to her murder. Malai was a sex worker who had come to Alaska from Thailand. She was trying to build a life in a foreign country, navigating language barriers and cultural differences. She was vulnerable, and Robert Hansen exploited that vulnerability. She was hunted through the wilderness and shot like an animal. Malai Larson, we remember you. 8. Tmrapdrson. Born 1964. Died 1983. Age 19 years old. Tamara Pedersen was just 19 years old when she was killed by Robert Hansen. She was a sex worker in Anchorage, trying to survive on the streets. Hansen confessed to killing her and dumping her body in a remote location. Her remains were recovered based on his directions. Tamara was a teenager, still just a child in many ways. She had her whole life ahead of her. Instead, she died terrified and alone in the Alaskan wilderness, murdered by a man who saw her as nothing more than prey. Tamara Pedersen, we remember you. 9. Angela Feddrn. Born 1956. Died February 1983. Age 27 years old. Angela Feddrn disappeared from Anchorage in February 1983. Her body was found in April 1984 in a shallow grave near Nick River. She had been shot. Angela was known for her artistic talents and her love of nature. She had struggled with personal issues but was working to turn her life around. She was kind and generous, often helping others even when she had little herself. She did not deserve what happened to her. Angela Feddrn, we remember you. 10. Palajolding. Born 1960. Died April 1983. Age 23 years old. Paula Gooding disappeared from Anchorage in April 1983. Her remains were found in September 1983 near Nick River. She had been shot. Hansen later confessed to her murder. Paula was a young mother who had turned to sex work to support her child. She was trying to survive in a difficult world, making choices that she hoped would provide for her baby. Instead, she was abducted, raped, and murdered. Her child was left without a mother. Paula Gooding, we remember you. 11. Trsawson. Born 1961. Died March 1983. Age 22 years old. Teresa Watson disappeared from Anchorage in March 1983. Her body was found in April 1984 in a remote wilderness area. She had been shot multiple times. Teresa was a sex worker who had come to Alaska from Washington State. She was trying to escape a troubled past and build a new life. Instead, she was hunted and killed by Robert Hansen. She died alone in the wilderness, her body not discovered for more than a year. Teresa Watson, we remember you. 12. Dlyn DeLynn Frey. Born 1960. Died 1983. Age 23 years old. DeLynn Frey disappeared from Anchorage in 1983. Her remains were recovered based on Hansen's confession. She had been shot. DeLynn was known for her bright personality and her love of animals. She had dreams of leaving sex work and opening an animal shelter. She talked about wanting to help creatures that were vulnerable and had no voice. Instead, she became a victim herself, hunted and killed in the wilderness. DeLynn Frey, we remember you. 1317. Additional confirmed victims. Robert Hansen confessed to killing at least 17 women. In addition to those named above, there were other victims whose identities have not been publicly released or whose remains have not been found. Some families have requested privacy. Some victims were never reported missing. Some remains have not been identified despite DNA analysis. These women, known and unknown, were all human beings. They all had lives that mattered. They all deserved better than what Robert Hansen did to them. We remember you, all of you. HANSEN's possible additional victims. Investigators believe Robert Hansen may have killed more than 30 women. He hinted at additional victims, describing murders he could not remember clearly, bodies he could not locate. Over the years, remains have been discovered in the Alaskan wilderness that may be linked to Hansen but have never been conclusively connected. If you are a family member of someone who disappeared in Alaska between 1971 and 1983, know that investigators have never stopped working to identify victims and bring closure. DNA technology has advanced significantly, and cold cases are being revisited with new tools. These women, all of them, identified and unidentified, must be remembered. They were not just sex workers or addicts or runaways. They were people. They had childhoods, families, dreams. They laughed, they cried, they loved, they struggled. And they all died terrified and alone because one man decided that their lives were worthless. But their lives were not worthless. Every single one of them mattered, and we honor their memory. Part 7. The Investigation GLENNFLOTHE and the Breakthrough. The case of Robert Hansen would never have been solved without the dogged determination of Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Glenn Floth. While many law enforcement officials had dismissed the disappearances of sex workers and dancers as women simply moving on or continuing their transient lifestyles, Floth saw something different. He saw a pattern, and he refused to let it go. Glenn Floth joined the Alaska State Troopers in the 1970s and quickly established himself as a meticulous and dedicated investigator. He worked numerous cases, but by the early 1980s, he had become increasingly concerned about a series of unsolved murders and missing persons cases involving young women in the Anchorage area. The victims shared common characteristics. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Most worked in the sex trade or as exotic dancers. Most had been seen last in downtown Anchorage, and most had simply vanished without a trace. Bodies had been discovered in remote wilderness areas, some shot, some decomposed beyond easy identification. But the cases were not connected. Each was treated as an isolated incident. There was no centralized investigation, no task force, no coordinated effort to determine whether these deaths were related. Floth believed they were. He began compiling information about missing women and unsolved murders. He created timelines, mapped locations, looked for connections. And the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that a serial killer was operating in Anchorage. But Floth faced significant obstacles. First, there was the systemic bias against sex workers. Many of his colleagues believed that these women were not priorities, that their lifestyles made them inherently risky, that their disappearances were not worth significant resources. This attitude was pervasive in law enforcement and in society more broadly. Second, there was the vastness of Alaska. Bodies dumped in the wilderness were incredibly difficult to find. Even when remains were discovered, they were often so decomposed that identification was nearly impossible. Without identifiable victims, building a case was extraordinarily difficult. Third, there was the lack of physical evidence. Most of the victims had been picked up in areas with no surveillance cameras. There were no witnesses to their abductions. There were no clues left at the scenes. The killer was careful, methodical, and successful at covering his tracks. But in June 1983, everything changed. Cindy Paulson escaped from Robert Hansen and went to the police. Her testimony gave Floth the first real lead he had ever had in the case. Floth interviewed Paulson extensively. He listened to her story with the seriousness it deserved. He did not dismiss her because she was a sex worker. He did not assume she was lying or exaggerating. He recognized that she was a credible witness who had survived an encounter with a very dangerous man. Paulson described Hansen's house, his car, his plane. She described the weapons he had, the methodical way he had prepared to kill her, the chilling calm with which he had described his plans. Every detail of her account rang true to Floth. This was not a fabrication. This was a woman who had barely escaped with her life. Floth began investigating Robert Hansen. He learned about Hansen's background, his childhood in Iowa, his criminal record for arson, his move to Alaska. He learned about Hansen's reputation as a skilled hunter and pilot, and he learned that Hansen had access to the remote wilderness areas where bodies had been found. Everything fit, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Flath faced resistance from within his own department. Some investigators were skeptical that a respected businessman could be a serial killer. They pointed out that Hansen had no criminal record in Alaska, that he was a family man, that he ran a successful bakery. They argued that Cindy Paulson's testimony was insufficient to justify the kind of intensive investigation Flath was proposing. But Flath was relentless. He built his case methodically, documenting every connection, every piece of circumstantial evidence. He argued that Hansen fit the profile of a serial killer, a man with a history of violence, a man with access and opportunity, a man whose victims fit a specific pattern. He pushed for search warrants, for surveillance, for the resources needed to investigate Hansen properly. And eventually, he got them. The search of Hansen's home in October 1983 vindicated Flath's instincts. The trophies, the map, the weapons, all of it confirmed what Flath had suspected. Robert Hansen was the killer he had been hunting. The interrogation of Hansen was Flath's masterpiece. He understood that obtaining a confession would be critical to securing a conviction. Physical evidence was important, but Hansen could potentially explain away some of it. A confession, however, would be devastating. Flath approached the interrogation strategically. He did not confront Hansen aggressively or accusatorily. Instead, he presented himself as someone who wanted to understand, who was interested in Hansen's perspective. He appealed to Hansen's ego, suggesting that Hansen was intelligent and that his actions must have had reasons that others might not appreciate. This approach worked. Hansen began to open up. He started by admitting to small things, picking up prostitutes, paying for sex. Flath would accept these admissions without judgment, encouraging Hansen to continue. Gradually, Hansen revealed more. He admitted to abducting women. He admitted to raping them. And eventually, he admitted to killing them. The confession was detailed and chilling. Hansen described his crimes with little emotion, as if he were recounting a series of hunting trips. He explained how he selected victims, how he lured them, how he flew them to remote locations. He described the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill. He provided information about burial sites, about weapons used, about specific victims. Flath documented everything. The confession would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But Flath's work did not end with Hansen's arrest. He spent months coordinating the searches for bodies in the wilderness. He worked with families of missing women, providing them with updates, helping them understand what had happened to their loved ones. He testified at Hansen's sentencing hearing, ensuring that the judge understood the full scope of Hansen's crimes. Glenn Flath is rightly regarded as the hero of this case. Without his persistence, his dedication, and his willingness to take seriously the disappearances of marginalized women, Robert Hansen might never have been caught. Hansen could have continued killing for years, claiming more victims, leaving more families in agonizing uncertainty. Flath's work also highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed Hansen to operate for so long. Law enforcement had not prioritized crimes against sex workers. Missing persons reports had been filed but not seriously investigated. Bodies had been found but not connected. It took one determined investigator, willing to see the pattern and willing to fight for justice, to bring Hansen down. After Hansen's conviction, Flath continued to work on cold cases, trying to identify additional victims and provide closure to families. He never forgot the women Hansen had killed. He carried their stories with him, determined that they would not be forgotten. Glenn Flath retired from the Alaska State Troopers in the 1990s, but his legacy endures. He is remembered as an investigator who cared deeply about victims, who refused to accept that some lives mattered less than others, who brought a serial killer to justice. The case of Robert Hansen is a testament to the importance of dedicated law enforcement, of taking every victim seriously, of refusing to give up even when the obstacles seem insurmountable. And it is a reminder that justice, when it comes, is often the result of one person's unwavering commitment to doing what is right. Part 8. The Psychology of Robert Hansen. What drives a man to hunt and kill other human beings? What psychological factors transform a bullied, insecure child into a serial killer? The case of Robert Hansen has been studied extensively by psychologists, criminologists, and FBI behavioral analysts. While no single explanation can fully account for Hansen's actions, a profile has emerged that helps us understand the mind of this killer. Robert Hansen exhibited many of the classic characteristics of a sexual sadist and organized serial killer. His crimes were planned, methodical, and driven by a need for power and control. But beneath the surface, Hansen's psychology was shaped by a lifetime of humiliation, rejection, and rage. Hansen's childhood experiences were foundational to his later behavior. The relentless bullying he endured, being mocked for his appearance, his stutter, his social awkwardness, created a deep well of resentment and shame. Children who are consistently victimized often develop one of two responses. They internalize the abuse and become withdrawn and depressed, or they externalize it and develop fantasies of revenge and domination. Hansen chose the latter path. He did not accept his victimization passively. Instead, he nursed his anger, fantasized about getting back at those who had hurt him, and eventually found ways to act on those fantasies. Psychologists identify a condition known as malignant narcissism, which combines narcissistic personality traits with antisocial behavior and sadism. Individuals with malignant narcissism have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. They are also capable of extreme cruelty and violence. Robert Hansen fit this profile. He saw himself as superior to others, particularly to the women he targeted. He believed that his intelligence and skills made him special, that he was smarter than the police, that he could commit crimes without being caught. His trophies, jewelry, and identification cards taken from victims were not just mementos. They were proof of his superiority, tangible evidence that he had dominated and destroyed other human beings. Hansen's choice of victims is also psychologically revealing. He targeted sex workers and dancers, women whom he perceived as representing the female sexuality that had been denied to him in his youth. These women, in Hansen's mind, were the ones who had rejected him, who had made him feel worthless. By dominating and killing them, he was symbolically getting revenge on all the women who had ever rejected him. This is a common pattern among serial killers who target prostitutes. The victims are seen not as individuals but as stand-ins for a broader category, women who are sexually available but who, in the killer's experience, have been unavailable to him. The murders are acts of displaced rage, attacks on symbols rather than people. Hansen's use of hunting as a method of murder is also significant. Hunting had been one of the few areas of Hansen's life where he felt competent and successful. He was a skilled marksman and woodsman. Hunting gave him a sense of power and control that he lacked in other areas. By hunting women, Hansen was combining his two sources of power, his skills as a hunter and his control over vulnerable victims. The hunt itself was the point. The fear, the chase, the inevitable capture and kill, this was what Hansen craved. It was not just about sexual gratification or even about the act of murder. It was about the process, the ritual, the feeling of being the apex predator. Psychologists also note the role of fantasy in Hansen's crimes. Long before he killed anyone, Hansen was likely engaging in elaborate violent fantasies. These fantasies would have started small, imagining confrontations with the people who had bullied him, fantasizing about power and revenge. Over time, the fantasies would have escalated, becoming more violent, more sexual, more detailed. For most people, fantasies remain fantasies. But for individuals like Hansen, the line between fantasy and action can blur. Hansen began acting on his fantasies in small ways, paying prostitutes for rough sex, asserting dominance in ways that stopped short of murder. These experiences reinforced the fantasies, making them more intense and more specific. And eventually, Hansen crossed the line from fantasy to murder. Once Hansen had killed for the first time, the psychological threshold had been breached. Murder became a part of his repertoire, a tool he could use to satisfy his need for power and control. And as with many serial killers, the murders became addictive. The thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill, these experiences were intensely rewarding for Hansen, reinforcing the behavior and making him want to do it again. Experts also point to the concept of cognitive distortions in understanding Hansen's psychology. Cognitive distortions are irrational thought patterns that allow people to justify harmful behavior. Hansen employed several such distortions. Dehumanization. Hansen did not see his victims as fully human. They were objects, prey, things to be used and discarded. This allowed him to kill without guilt or remorse. Blaming the victim. Hansen believed that his victims deserved what happened to them. They were prostitutes, drug addicts, people living on the margins. In his mind, they were worthless, and killing them was not a significant moral transgression. Minimization. Hansen downplayed the severity of his actions. He framed his crimes as hunting, a normal and even admirable activity. By using the language and framework of hunting, he avoided confronting the reality that he was murdering human beings. Entitlement. Hansen believed he was owed something: respect, admiration, sexual access to women. When he did not receive what he believed he deserved, he felt justified in taking it by force. These cognitive distortions are common among violent offenders. They allow individuals to commit horrific acts while maintaining a self-image as a normal, even admirable person. Hansen ran a successful business, was a devoted father, participated in his community, all while secretly committing serial murder. He was able to compartmentalize his life, keeping his crimes separate from his public persona. Finally, it is important to note that Robert Hansen was not insane in the legal or clinical sense. He understood the nature of his actions. He knew that killing was wrong and illegal. He took steps to avoid detection, which demonstrates that he was capable of rational thought and planning. He was not psychotic. He did not hear voices or suffer from delusions. What Hansen was is a psychopath, an individual with a profound lack of empathy, an inability to feel guilt or remorse, and a willingness to exploit and harm others for personal gratification. Psychopathy is a personality disorder, not a mental illness. Psychopaths are aware of societal norms and laws. They simply do not care. Understanding Hansen's psychology does not excuse his actions. It does not make him less responsible for the murders he committed. But it does help us understand how such horrors can occur, how an ordinary-seeming person can harbor such darkness, and how childhood trauma and social rejection can, in rare cases, create a monster. The case of Robert Hansen is a reminder that serial killers are made, not born. They are shaped by their experiences, their environments, and their choices. And while we can identify risk factors and warning signs, predicting who will become violent remains an imperfect science. What we can do is take seriously the signs that someone is moving down a dangerous path: early cruelty to animals, violent fantasies, escalating antisocial behavior. We can create systems that identify and intervene with at-risk individuals. And we can remember that while we may never fully understand what drives someone to commit such evil, we have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable and bring killers to justice. Part 9. The trial and SENTNCING. The legal proceedings against Robert Hansen were, in many ways, anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming. Hansen had confessed. Physical evidence linked him to the crimes. Survivors like Cindy Paulson were prepared to testify. The prosecution had built an airtight case. Hansen's defense attorneys faced an impossible situation. Their client was guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. There was no viable defense based on innocence. The only question was whether Hansen would go to trial, where he would almost certainly be convicted and potentially face the death penalty, or whether he would accept a plea deal. In early 1984, negotiations began between Hansen's defense team and the Alaska Attorney General's office. The defense proposed a plea agreement. Hansen would plead guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping in exchange for the state not seeking the death penalty. Alaska had abolished the death penalty in 1957, but it had been reinstated in 1984 for certain aggravated murders. Hansen's crimes, multiple murders, murders committed during kidnappings, fell under the categories for which the death penalty could be sought. The defense knew that if Hansen went to trial and was convicted, he could be sentenced to death. The prosecution considered the offer carefully. A trial would be expensive and time-consuming. It would require victims' families to endure testimony about the horrific details of their loved ones' deaths. And while the outcome seemed certain, there was always a risk. Juries can be unpredictable, and a single holdout could result in a mistrial. More importantly, Hansen had information that investigators needed. He knew where additional bodies were buried. He could provide details that would help identify victims. If he went to trial and was convicted, he might refuse to cooperate, taking those secrets to his grave. The prosecution decided that a plea deal was in the best interests of justice. Hansen would plead guilty, receive a sentence that ensured he would never be released, and agree to cooperate with investigators in locating additional victims. On February 18, 1984, Robert Hansen appeared in Anchorage Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and family members of victims. Hansen, dressed in a suit and flanked by his attorneys, stood before Judge Ralph E. Moody. The charges were read aloud: 4 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count of kidnapping. Each charge was accompanied by a description of the crime. Hansen listened without expression as the prosecutor detailed how he had abducted, raped, and murdered young women, how he had hunted them in the wilderness, how he had buried their bodies in remote graves. When asked how he pleaded, Hansen spoke quietly, "Guilty." The judge then asked Hansen a series of questions to ensure that he understood the implications of his plea, that he was pleading guilty voluntarily, and that he had not been coerced. Hansen answered each question affirmatively. The sentencing hearing followed immediately. The prosecutor presented victim impact statements from families of the deceased. Paulette Larson, the mother of Malai Larson, spoke through tears about her daughter's life and the devastation her death had caused. "My daughter came to this country seeking a better life," Larson said. "She was kind and generous. She did not deserve to die the way she did. Robert Hansen took her from us, and our family will never be whole again." Other family members spoke as well, describing the pain of losing a loved one, the anguish of not knowing what had happened for years, and the horror of learning the truth. Several expressed anger that Hansen would not face the death penalty, that he would be allowed to live while their loved ones were dead. Hansen's attorneys did not present a defense or argue for leniency. There was no defense to present. Hansen had committed the crimes, and the sentence had already been negotiated. Judge Moody then delivered the sentence: 461 years in prison plus life without the possibility of parole. The sentence was structured to ensure that even if some convictions were overturned on appeal, Hansen would still spend the rest of his life in prison. Judge Moody addressed Hansen directly. "Mr. Hansen, you have committed crimes of extraordinary cruelty. You hunted and killed young women as if they were animals. You showed no mercy, no remorse, no humanity. You destroyed families. You terrorized a community. And you did all of this while presenting yourself as a respectable member of society." Moody continued, "The sentence I am imposing ensures that you will never be free again. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, removed from society, paying for what you have done. I can only hope that in the years ahead, you will reflect on the suffering you have caused and feel some measure of remorse." Hansen showed no emotion during the sentencing. He was led out of the courtroom in shackles, his life as a free man over. After the sentencing, Hansen was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. The facility is a maximum security prison located about 100 miles south of Anchorage, surrounded by mountains and accessible only by a single road. It was an isolated, harsh place, fitting, in a way, for a man who had used Alaska's isolation to commit his crimes. Hansen adapted to prison life with the same methodical approach he had brought to his crimes. He kept to himself, avoided confrontations, and followed the rules. He worked in the prison bakery, using the skills he had learned from his father. He read extensively and participated in some prison programs, though he never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes. Over the years, Hansen was interviewed by investigators, journalists, and psychologists. He was willing to discuss his crimes in detail, describing the murders with the same detachment he had shown during his confession. He seemed to view his crimes as a curiosity, something to be analyzed and understood, rather than atrocities to be mourned. Hansen occasionally cooperated with investigators seeking to locate additional victims. He provided information about burial sites and described murders he had not previously confessed to. Some of this information led to the recovery of remains. Other information was too vague to be useful, and some investigators suspected that Hansen was exaggerating his victim count to enhance his notoriety. In the decades following his imprisonment, Hansen's health declined. He developed cancer and other age-related illnesses. On August 21, 2014, Robert Christian Hansen died in Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage. He was 75 years old. Hansen's death brought a measure of closure to some families, though the pain of their losses remained. For others, his death was frustrating. He had taken secrets to the grave, victims whose names and stories would never be fully known. Robert Hansen never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes. He never apologized to the families of his victims. He died as he had lived, self-centered, unrepentant, disconnected from the humanity of the people he had destroyed. Part 10. Aftermath and Systemic Failures. The case of Robert Hansen exposed profound failures in how law enforcement and society respond to crimes against marginalized individuals. Hansen was able to kill for more than a decade, claiming at least 17 lives and possibly many more, in part because the systems meant to protect people failed to take his victims seriously. The most glaring failure was the treatment of sex workers by law enforcement. When women disappeared from Anchorage's red light district, police often assumed they had simply moved on. Missing persons reports were filed but not aggressively investigated. The prevailing attitude was that sex workers led risky lives, and disappearances were an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of that lifestyle. This systemic bias had deadly consequences. Hansen specifically targeted sex workers because he knew that their disappearances would not trigger intensive investigations. He understood that society viewed these women as less valuable, less worthy of protection. And he was right. Cindy Paulson's experience with the Anchorage Police Department is illustrative. When she escaped from Hansen and reported her abduction and assault, officers were initially skeptical. They questioned her credibility because she was a sex worker. They were inclined to believe Hansen, a respected businessman, over Paulson, a woman with a criminal record. This dynamic is not unique to the Hansen case. Throughout history, serial killers have exploited societal biases, targeting victims they believe will not be missed: sex workers, runaways, addicts, immigrants, the homeless. And time and again, law enforcement has failed to prioritize these cases, allowing killers to operate for years. The Hansen case prompted some changes in how Alaska law enforcement approached missing persons cases. After Hansen's arrest, the Alaska State Troopers established protocols for investigating disappearances of sex workers and other marginalized individuals. They created a database of missing persons that could be cross-referenced with unidentified remains. They trained officers to take reports seriously regardless of the victim's lifestyle. But systemic change is slow and biases are deeply ingrained. Even today, sex workers and other marginalized individuals face barriers when reporting crimes. They are often not believed. They are blamed for their own victimization, and their cases are not prioritized. The Hansen case also highlighted the challenges of policing in a vast, sparsely populated area like Alaska. The state covers more than 600,000 square miles, much of it wilderness accessible only by plane or boat. Searching for evidence or remains in such an environment is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Hansen exploited this geography ruthlessly. He flew his victims to remote locations where their bodies would likely never be found. He understood that the vastness of Alaska would conceal his crimes, and he was largely correct. Many of his victims' remains were discovered only because he confessed and provided specific locations. Without that information, they would still be lost in the wilderness. Modern technology has improved law enforcement's ability to investigate cases like Hansen's. DNA analysis can identify victims from minimal remains. Geographic profiling can help predict where a serial offender might strike next. Surveillance cameras and digital records make it harder for killers to operate undetected. But technology is only as effective as the people using it. If law enforcement does not prioritize certain victims, if investigators do not take reports seriously, if society continues to view some lives as less valuable than others, then killers like Robert Hansen will continue to exploit those vulnerabilities. The families of Hansen's victims have spoken about the painful aftermath of his crimes. Many described feeling ignored and dismissed when they first reported their loved ones missing. They were told that their daughters or sisters had probably just moved on, that they would turn up eventually. When remains were finally discovered, the families faced a new kind of anguish: confirmation that their loved ones were dead, along with the horrific details of how they had died. Some families have advocated for changes in how missing persons cases are investigated. They have called for mandatory follow-up on reports, for databases that track patterns of disappearance, for training that emphasizes the importance of taking every victim seriously. The case also raised questions about Hansen's wife and children. Darla Hansen and her 2 children lived with Robert for years without knowing what he was doing. There is no evidence that Darla had any knowledge of her husband's crimes. She was, by all accounts, a victim herself, a woman who trusted her husband and was horrified to learn the truth. After Hansen's arrest, Darla and the children faced public scrutiny and judgment. They were forced to grapple with the reality that the man they had loved and trusted was a serial killer. They eventually left Alaska and started new lives elsewhere, seeking anonymity and distance from the nightmare. Robert Hansen's story is also a reminder of the danger of complacency. Hansen was hiding in plain sight. He was a member of the community, a business owner, a father. He looked normal. He acted normal, and that normalcy was his disguise. Serial killers are not always the shadowy strangers we imagine. They are sometimes our neighbors, our coworkers, the people we see every day. They rely on our assumptions. that people who look and act normal must be safe, that those who are successful and respected must be trustworthy. The case of Robert Hansen teaches us to be vigilant, to take seriously the signs that something is wrong, and to remember that monsters do not always look like monsters. Part 11. Impact on Alaska and Legacy. The case of Robert Hansen left an indelible mark on Alaska. The state, with its rugged individualism and frontier ethos, prided itself on being a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past did not matter as much as a person's willingness to work hard and contribute. But Hansen's crimes shattered that image, revealing that Alaska's isolation and vastness could be exploited by predators. For years after Hansen's arrest, Alaskans grappled with the realization that one of their own had committed such atrocities. How had no one noticed? How had Hansen been able to operate for so long without arousing suspicion? The questions were uncomfortable, and the answers were troubling. The case also had a profound impact on Anchorage's sex work community. Women who had been working on 4th Avenue were terrified. Some left the city, seeking safety elsewhere. Others banded together, forming informal networks to warn each other about dangerous clients and to keep track of who was missing. Advocates for sex workers used the Hansen case to call for decriminalization and better protections. They argued that criminalizing sex work made women more vulnerable, forcing them to operate in the shadows and making them reluctant to report violence to police. If sex work were legal and regulated, advocates argued, women would be safer, and predators like Hansen would have fewer opportunities. These arguments gained some traction, but progress was slow. Alaska, like most of the United States, continued to criminalize sex work, and the vulnerabilities that Hansen had exploited remained largely unaddressed. The case also influenced how law enforcement agencies across the country approached investigations of serial killings. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit studied the Hansen case extensively, using it as a teaching example in training programs for investigators. Hansen's meticulous planning, his careful selection of victims, his use of geographic isolation, all of these elements became part of the profile of an organized serial killer. The aviation map found in Hansen's home became one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in true crime history. The image of that map, with its small X's marking burial sites, has been reproduced in countless documentaries, books, and articles. It is a chilling reminder of Hansen's cold, methodical approach to murder. In the decades since Hansen's arrest, several books and documentaries have been produced about the case. The most comprehensive is Butcher, Baker, written by Walter Gilmer and Leland E. Hale. Gilmer was a former Anchorage Daily News reporter who covered the case extensively and later collaborated with investigators to document Hansen's crimes. The book provides a detailed account of the investigation, the victims, and Hansen's eventual capture. In 2013, a film titled The Frozen Ground, starring Nicolas Cage as Glenn Floth and John Cusack as Robert Hansen, dramatized the case. While the film took some creative liberties, it introduced Hansen's crimes to a new generation and highlighted the courage of Cindy Paulson and the determination of Floth. The Hansen case also had lasting effects on the families of his victims. For many, the discovery of their loved ones' remains brought a measure of closure, but it also forced them to confront the horrific details of how they had died. Some families have spoken publicly about their experiences, hoping to honor their loved ones and to advocate for changes that might prevent similar tragedies. Other families have chosen to remain private, grieving quietly and trying to move forward. The trauma of losing a loved one to murder is profound, and for the families of Hansen's victims, that trauma was compounded by years of uncertainty and by the knowledge that their loved ones had died alone and terrified in the wilderness. Advocates continue to work to identify Hansen's remaining victims. Advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy have made it possible to identify remains that were previously unidentifiable. In 2023, the victim known for decades as Eklutna Annie was finally identified as Andrea Altieri, bringing closure to her family more than 40 years after her death. Similar efforts are ongoing for other unidentified victims. Investigators are re-examining cold cases, comparing DNA from remains to databases of missing persons, and using genealogy to trace family connections. The hope is that every victim will eventually be identified, that every family will receive answers. The case of Robert Hansen is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of marginalized individuals and the importance of vigilance, empathy, and justice. It is a story of systemic failures, of a killer who exploited societal biases, and of the investigators and families who refused to let his victims be forgotten. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. The story of Robert Hansen is, at its core, a story about power, control, and the darkest impulses of human nature. It is a story about a man who felt powerless and humiliated as a child, and who spent his adult life exacting revenge on women he believed represented the source of his suffering. It is a story about the exploitation of the vulnerable and the failures of systems meant to protect them. But it is also a story about resilience, about survivors like Cindy Paulson who escaped and who had the courage to come forward. It is a story about dedicated investigators like Glenn Floth who refused to give up, who saw patterns where others saw randomness, and who brought a killer to justice. And it is a story about the families who loved and mourned the victims, who fought to keep their memories alive, and who demanded accountability. Robert Hansen killed at least 17 women and possibly many more. Each of those women had a life, a story, a family. They were not just sex workers or addicts or runaways. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. They were people who had hopes and dreams, who had experienced joy and pain, who had loved and been loved. Hansen saw them as less than human. He saw them as prey, as objects to be hunted and discarded. But they were not objects, they were people, and they mattered. The case of Robert Hansen forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society. It forces us to acknowledge that some lives are valued less than others, that some victims receive less attention and less justice. It forces us to reckon with the biases that allow killers like Hansen to operate for years before being caught. We must do better. We must take seriously every report of violence, every missing person, every victim, regardless of their occupation, their lifestyle, their background. We must create systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. We must train law enforcement to see every victim as worthy of justice. And we must remember that behind every crime, there is a human being whose life has been stolen, whose family has been shattered, whose potential has been destroyed. The victims of Robert Hansen must not be forgotten. They must be remembered as people, not as statistics. Their names must be spoken. Their stories must be told. And their deaths must serve as a reminder of what can happen when society fails to protect those who need protection most. Joanna Messina, Lisa Futrell, Sherry Morrow, Andrea Altieri, Sue Luna, Malai Larson, Tamara Pedersen, Angela Federn, Paula Gooding, Teresa Watson, DeLynn Frey, and all the others known and unknown. We remember you, we honor you, and we commit to ensuring that your lives were not lost in vain. Robert Hansen died in 2014, but the pain he caused endures. The families he destroyed continue to grieve. The survivors he terrorized continue to carry the scars, and the community he betrayed continues to reckon